Hello, my name is Rich Howard, owner of Architectural Builder Supply. In this video is to bring you a closer look at the PBB, their part number CB81, 4.5 by 4, 646. This is the hinge right here, a CB81. So what does CB81 mean? Let's dissect the part number. First of all, C stands for concealed bearing. That means inherently from PBB that this is a three knuckle hinge. It has concealed bearings. Concealed bearing CB. 81 means that it's made of steel versus the 51, which would be stainless steel. The 21, which would be made of a brass or bronze-based material. And PBB actually has a very elegant system by which their part numbers run. Maybe a little difficult to think about initially, but the way I remember the base materials is 81 is steel, go 30 down. 51 is stainless steel, go 30 down. 21 is brass or bronze. You know, that's how I think of it. 81, 51, 21. Steel, stainless, brass, bronze. Now, CB does inherently mean three knuckle. Some people like three knuckle hinges because some people, and I wouldn't disagree, this strikes them as a bit more modern or architectural or less common. You don't see three knuckle hinges very often. One nice thing about three knuckle hinges is that you really don't see much of the pin. The way that this pin is designed is that it basically sits flush and you don't see any of it. A three knuckle design, I think, is more aesthetically pleasing than a five knuckle, with all of the additional movement that occurs on the hinge itself. The fact that the bearings are concealed gives it a very clean sort of look, but does still permit, of course, your ability to use it on fire-rated doors, being ball bearing, and certainly being a steel-based hinge that would permit it to be used there. It's going to be a 4.5 by 4, and that means that it is 4.5 inches tall and 4-inch wide. What's important to know about the size of the hinge being 4.5 by 4 is it's important to understand that the height is the first dimension. It can be counterintuitive to someone who doesn't spend any time in the door hardware industry. You may not be able to notice it, but to my trained eyes, that does not look square. It definitely looks rectangular. And it is 4.5 tall and 4 wide. It's very important that when you order doors and frames that you understand the height is the first dimension on a hinge. But what's interesting on a door is that it's the second dimension. Really important to know. I did a job many years ago, and about 20 doors, and a couple of them were specified as 3'6" doors or 4 foot, I forget. But the hinge was a 5-inch hinge. 5 by 4.5. 4.5, 4.5 on all the 3-foot doors, 5 by 4.5 on everything else. I was so green in the industry, I supplied the guy with 4.5-inch tall preps, 5-inch wide hinges. Well, the engineer comes through and says, these two 3'6" doors, they've got the wrong hinges on them. They're 5 by 4.5. I'm like, yeah, they're 5 by 4.5. And I, of course, realized in that humbling, sobering experience that I misunderstood how hinges were defined. And luckily for me, we were not forced to change doors and frames. The frames had already been grouted in. But what we did do was came up with heavyweight hinges so that giving the ability of a thicker hinge rather than a standard weight hinge to do the job. Luckily, the doors and frames were field convertible to a heavyweight hinge, so the engineer was satisfied. But I learned a very valuable lesson at almost no cost. Nonetheless, I have been with a firm understanding of how hinges are measured from that day on. Now, where would you use a 4.5 by 4? Well, I'll tell you, where you see 4.5 by 4 is an aluminum storefront. Aluminum storefront doors seem to like that 4-inch wide hinge. And I think it's because, well, generally exterior doors, aluminum storefront, right, that swing out. A narrower hinge, this would be a 1/4 inch less projection when the hinge is closed than a 4.5, 4.5. Aluminum storefront doors will generally be able to swing to 180 degrees or well past 90. Having less projecting hardware is always advantageous. You want less of the hardware sticking off the face of the door and frame, and you'll also see it if you have, believe it or not, a residential job, which is what this is, 3-knuckle concealed bearing 4.5 inch by 4, a residential project where there are doors that swing out. The less projecting hardware is safer. If you've ever, it will happen to someone once or twice a year, it seems. You're walking down the hall and you just whack your watch on the door lever. Keeping the hardware tucked back against the door and frame as much as possible is always advantageous, and in my opinion, a more correct way to specify the hardware as a result. Providing you don't have any sort of trim or casing or baseboard that you need to get out and around, you know, consider the fact of pulling that hinge knuckle back. If you're going to 90 degrees or you're not going really much past 110, you probably don't have much a need to get, you know, more than a 4-inch wide hinge when you're dealing with an 1 3/4 door, which would be appropriate for a 4.5, 4.5, or a 4.5 by 4. If you had an 1 3/8 thick door, you'd want to certainly go with a 3.5 inch wide. This wouldn't be used for aluminum storefront because of the square corners generally. That would have a very small radius, like a 3/32 radius on the hinge. But being satin nickel, you know, you're going to see this in an interior application, commercial or residential, is where you'll see a 4.5 by 4. Those are the two scenarios where I'll see it. Specifically aluminum storefront, specifically residential where they want the hardware to project out further, less than standard. And if you ever take note of a hinge, a commercial hinge, you might say to yourself, yeah, that, at least to me, that 4.5 inch wide hinge really does kind of stand proud of the door and frame. And in lots of instances, it just doesn't need to stick off that far. And I think as a result, it would be better to bring it back a little bit. Okay, this is a 646. That means three things. It means it's made of steel. We've already inferred that in the 81 part of the part number. But 646 tells us in terms of the finish, it's steel. 646 means satin nickel versus 619, which means satin nickel. The difference is 646 means steel base with a clear lacquer over it. Okay, very nice tidy hinge, nice tight margins. If I was going to make one comment about what I'd like to see better, I would wish that the logo was slightly smaller. Not that they shouldn't be proud of their high quality product, but even the Stanley logo is awfully tiny. And you know, they've been making hinges since Polk was president. So I like imported manufacturers to use a slightly smaller hinge. We got it. It's PBB. That's great. But no reason to make a billboard size out of the logo. Just my opinion. Having said that, I have incredibly small negative things to say. I have nothing negative to say about PBB. Screws are going to be included. Just pulling the screws out. This project, you're going to get wood screws and machine screws. This is packaged with all wood and all machine for the hinge. You can't possibly need all wood screws and all machine screws, but that's how these are packaged. Generally, what you'll find with commercial hinges is you'll get all machine screws and half wood. It's always a great idea to specify exactly what you want when it comes to screws so that there's no shortage. Because if you're dealing with, a satin nickel hinge or an oil rub bronze hinge or a satin bronze hinge or a polished brass hinge, you've got to make sure you've got the right screws from the factory. You're not just going to go to the home center and pick up a number 12 by 1.25 inch, threaded to the head wood screw, flat head, or an undercut head. If it's a machine application, undercut means that the underside of the head is undercut head, so that a very large number 12 screw can fit flush onto a very thin piece of material. That's why they undercut the head. Specify what screw package you want. AWS, all wood screws. AMS, all machine screws. Half wood screw, half machine screw. Let us know. We'll get the factory to supply it exactly correct so that there's no shortage of what you need. Okay. Now this is a full mortise hinge. That means when the leaves, well, what I mean to say is from the swag on the hinge leaf here, this area here, when the leaves are brought parallel, it's meant to be mortised flush to the edge of the door and frame. So it's a full mortise hinge. Very typical, versus half surface, half mortise, full surface, other variants of hinges. There's a link below this video to a cut sheet and to a template that are there for your review. And I'm looking at the cut sheet. It does refer to that it's for a medium weight door receiving medium frequency use. Attractive, slim barrel with flush pins and plugs. Flush plug. Just everything here is flat. You just don't see anything. Could you drive that pin out if you wanted? Yes, you sure could if you wanted to. Not that you would need to. It does feature a non-rising pin, and what that means is a non-rising pin will resist the temptation of slowly rising out of the barrel with time, because as those knuckles wear against each other, it's kind of working to extrude or push the pin up and out of the barrel. And so a non-rising pin will generally have knurling on the outside of the Now, when it comes to a non-rising pin, you might need to consider security options. You can do this type of hinge with a non-removable pin feature, which means there's going to be in the barrel of the hinge a drilled and tapped hole with a set screw, so that from the exterior you'll see a little piece of the set screw head sticking out, but you can't get the tool to it. And once you have that pin seated, and then you loosen the set screw, you're going to hang the door. Let's say you remove the two leaves, door leaf, frame leaf, hang the door, tap the pins down, get them flush. After you've backed out the set screws, put the pins down, then tighten them up. Once you tighten up that set screw, it's going to seat into a groove that's in the pin, all but eliminating the chance of you driving that pin out. It's a security feature that you would use for sure on outswinging doors. Exterior outswinging doors, you would always use an NRP. Being PBB, they can do a security stud as well. It would certainly be a special order. Would have a big piece of metal sticking out of here, about the diameter of a nickel, about 3/8 thick or so that when you close the hinge, that big stud would fit into a hole in the opposite leaf of the hinge, so that when you closed the door, let's say you even drove the pin out, that big stud sticking into the leaf is going to prevent you from separating the two leaves. I've tried to drive a pin out with a security pin, a non-removable pin, an NRP is what they're called, and it's all but impossible. So you're really not going to do that. One other thing I'd like to point out, because PBB will point it out to you. You see the face of the hinge and how it's finished? You see the back of the hinge and how it's finished? A lot of manufacturers don't treat the back of that hinge in terms of treating it as a finished surface. PBB certainly does, and they've been doing it that way for as long as I'm aware of. Okay, this is 134 thousandths thick. Would be typical for this hinge, and a 4.5 by 4 or 4.5, 4.5. The template will show you the location of those screw holes we talked about earlier. If you're replacing hinges, you might want to confirm those dimensions so that there's no surprise when you get the hinge in your hand. That these locations all relate to an ANSI standard, an A156. I think the document is .7, defining the actual physical placement of these screw holes for the location of the screws. If you've got a commercial hollow metal frame that's been made in the last 40 plus years, this is going to work perfectly for you. Most likely, just check that's 4.5. Finally, there's a link below this video to the manufacturer's page where you can pull up not only all of the PBB products that we sell, but a link to the manufacturer's website, as well as a link to the full product catalog. I do recommend that you consider PBB, and here's why. Very good quality product, incredibly deep inventory, even better when it comes to their responsiveness, their customer service, getting stuff shipped out, instantaneous. They're just really an incredibly well-oiled machine, and that's why I move in their direction as much business as I can, because they take something that people take for granted, a hinge, and they keep it no nonsense. They keep it something that you can continue to not give much thought to. You're only thinking about it if it's a problem. There you go. PBB keeps it simple. Any questions on the CB81 4.5x4 and a 646 finish, or any other PBB product, please feel free to reach out to us. Thank you.